I'm a believer in getting out of one's comfort zone, or at least I thought I was till yesterday at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. As a ski instructor here in Park City, I much prefer the height of ski boots over heels, favor the functionality of Gore-Tex over linen, and definitely prefer Patagonia over Prada. So fear, how often do we ever talk about fear? We experience it, we ignore it, we compartmentalize it, and we hide it. But do we ever really address it? Think of all the times in our lives and all the time fear consumes us. It consumes a tremendous amount of energy, spiritual, emotional, and physical, in our personal lives, in our work, and in our pursuits. As a West Point grad and Army officer, I learned to confine my own fear and exploit the fear in others, but never to deal with it. I just sucked it up and drove on. But fear can be a great motivator. It can keep us sharp and cautious. It can help us take a step back and reevaluate. And at other times, we just need to ignore fear and move on. But fear often blurs our perceptions and obscures our past. And we need to make a conscious decision of how to exploit it to be productive. So when I confront fear, I typically turn to words. And the first words I talk to are of the great philosopher, Dr. Seuss. Armed with his witty wisdom, think left, think right, think high, and think low. Oh, the things you can think if you only try. So you need to know a little bit about me. Well, I have a passion for speed and a need for change. In 1999, Ted, my spouse, and I decided to pursue our business careers in 2 different cities. First in Boston, and second here in Park City. The latter for the New England charm and chowder, intellectual and ethnic diversity, and of course, the Red Sox. Park City for its mountain lifestyle, its laid-back attitude, its access to art, and its proximity to 7 ski resorts. On a trip here, I visited the Utah Olympic Park, what was then to become the venue of the 2002 bobsled, skeleton, and luge events for the Olympic Games. I walked down the mile-long track, and I witnessed these amazing athletes sliding at 75 miles an hour down this ice culvert. And as I got to the end, I saw a newspaper article taped on the only window in the whole park, and the headlines read, IOC approves women's bobsled for the '02 Games. Well, I don't know how many of you have ever been up there. As a young child, I had Olympic dreams. I remember fondly Olga Korbut and Greg Louganis competing in '76 in the Montreal Olympics. I had been a diver, but a frightening diving accident had left me with more mental than physical scars, and I quit the sport. And here I was. I had just found my sport. I grabbed the first person I saw and started querying him. He backed away and he said, look, lady, you need to talk to one of the athletes. So I convinced a bobsled pilot to give me a ride down the track. It forever changed my life. I flew back to Boston, and I met with my CEO and my boss, and I shared with them that I had the rest of my life to work and only one chance to make an Olympic team, and that I was quitting and moving to Park City. They kind of smiled and grinned. You see, they had both been semi-pro baseball players who once too dreamed of athletic glory, but fell just short. On the other hand, the teams I managed around the world thought I was crazy. How could I leave a secure job and a great company to go pursue this dream? And there I was, confronted with the fear of failure, and so began that uphill climb for that downhill dream. Well, bobsledding is one of the original Olympic sports. It's like Formula One racing, except on ice. It's a world of multi-million-dollar tracks, precision-engineered sleds with drag coefficients more slippery than a highly waxed Ferrari due to diamond-polished runners. Athletes come from backgrounds of speed and explosive power. And the combination of the athleticism and the technology, there is no other sport that boasts a true mix of science, technology, and sport. Only two stand at the start line. It takes a team of people to get you to that start line. And that team formed back at West Point. See, I wrote the track coach with an introduction, an explanation, and a dream. And 48 hours later, the head sprint coach called me. He had researched bobsledding, he laid out the plan, and he issued the operations order. I was to report back to West Point in 2 weeks for the first of what would be many 6-week training blocks. And so when I arrived, I was staying with friends, the 3-a-day workouts commenced, and it put me right back to where I had been as a plebe 13 years earlier, pushed to my limits, exhausted, sleep-deprived, deer-in-the-headlights stare, and perpetually hungry. One night at dinner, my friend said, you should call the Center for Enhanced Performance. So that next morning, in another well-rehearsed speech, I picked up the phone, and a Dr. Nate Zinzer answered it. And once again, very neatly, I laid out that introduction, that explanation, and that dream. And there was a pause. And then he said, "How much do you weigh?" Now, I don't know how many women like getting asked how much they weigh, and I certainly didn't. And so I told him, and he paused again, and he said, "Isn't that a little light for a bobsledder?" And I said, "It may be a little light, but I'm fast, and I'm strong, and I'm willing to work like hell." He said, "Be up in my office in an hour." And that's where the team formed, and it continued to grow. Throughout the summer, I met others, and one happened to be a gentleman here from Park City that I met at Lake Placid. Ironically, I thought he was one of the guys I had gone to school with who was also an athlete, but he ended up being the sports scientist and physiologist for the men's ski jumping team, a sport that requires explosive speed and power. And so we arranged a little barter. He would write my training plans, I would train with him, and I would cook for him. That was a pretty good deal. He then introduced me to his mentor, Vern Gambetta, the nation's top acceleration coach. And although Scott had laid the groundwork, Vern was skeptical. Here I show up at Vern's home base in Sarasota, Florida. Now picture this. I'm 34 years old, a West Point grad, Army officer, corporate executive with no background in a sport dealing with speed and explosive power, and I want to go to the Olympics. After that first day, Vern realized there was no way he was going to be able to talk me out of it, and he too joined the team. Well, in 2001, with Shannon Hartnett, an 8-time World Highlands champion, as my brakeman, we competed in the U.S. Winter Olympic Team Trials. And as we stood at the start block for that fourth and final run of day 2, that moment is forever cemented in my mind. The crowd cheering, the cowbells ringing, the butterflies fluttering, and the fear of failure. There I was at the start line, and it was time to launch. We drove to a personal best that day, and we finished 4th. The top 2 drivers and their brakewomen made the Olympic team, and 2 months later, USA number 2 won a gold in the debut of women's bobsled. It was a moment that was ever cemented in my mind and reminds me often of what has been said: life is not about the breaths you take, but by the moments that take your breath away. Well, having overcome my fear of doing things I knew nothing about, and despite my disappointment, I very much wanted to give back to this community, a community who had supported me at that track and throughout the training process. And I became the executive director of the People's Health Clinic, a grassroots not-for-profit started here by Dr. John Hanrahan, Pamela Atkinson, and Bob Bussin. And the mission was to provide health care to all those who don't have access to it. Well, when I took it over, there was 6 weeks of operating cash. We provided services out of a souped-up RV in which we had no driver with a commercial driver's license, no place to park the vehicle, and no way to communicate with our patients, and just a few liabilities on the book. And there it was again, confronted by fear. This time, the fear of disappointment, the fear of not being able to deliver. See, there were other people who were dependent upon me now. These workers, these individuals, parents and children, and this was their only access to health care. Access to health care is not a sexy issue, but it's a vital one, and it's critical to a community, to our schools, to our places of work, and to our economy. And although I knew little about the delivery of health care at that time, and even less about the practice of medicine, I knew how to build a team. And with that team, we turned that organization around, and we put it on financially stable ground, and we're able to provide access to more than 10,000 people who didn't have a way to get primary care. And then I was confronted with another issue and fear. I was pregnant. Now, I don't know how this happened after 16 years of marriage, but there I was, pregnant and running a not-for-profit. And a little bit concerned about how I was going to manage the responsibilities of running an operation with the responsibilities of having a child, I decided to take a leave. But that break only lasted 6 months when I was presented with the opportunity to coach the girls' volleyball team here in Park City High School. So having come off this Olympic training and being an athlete myself, I had come up with this wonderful plan of strength training, plyometric exercises, team building, sprinting. If nothing else, regardless of the skills of my young athletes, we were going to be the best disciplined, most conditioned team in our league. I also had a little bit of incentive in that I wanted to get back in shape myself after giving birth to Carly 6 months earlier. And there that first day, once again, I was shocked. My teenage girls showed up with spaghetti strap bras, a considerable amount of jewelry and makeup, and open skate shoes. Oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And here it was again, the fear of being relevant, the fear of how am I going to connect with these young women. And so, reverting back to my military background, I issued a couple of rules, and they came out like a 3-round shotgun burst. And the first one was the 3 B's rule, and that's not the be bold, be brief, be gone rule. It was, there will be no butts, bellies, or breasts visible anywhere, anytime, with anything having to do with volleyball. The second one was we were going to wear athletic bras, and we were going to tie our shoes. I spent a considerable amount of time that first practice teaching girls how to tie their shoes, which has become a lost art with the invention of Velcro and the proliferation of flip-flops. And the third was we were going to do push-ups. And when I first told my girls, let's do some push-ups, I didn't quite say it that nicely, I was queried, Coach McAleer, what kind of push-up? And I said, a push-up, a regular push-up. She said, what's a regular push-up? And so I got down and I demonstrated. I heard her in the back go, oh, you mean man push-ups? Well, as far as I had learned at West Point in the Army, push-ups didn't have a gender, and we all assumed the front-leaning rest position. Well, I came away that day exhausted and inspired. You see, here we are bombarded with images of women selling everything from beer to cars. And sexual allure is prophesized as the Rosetta Stone of esteem, power, and confidence by a media who regularly objectifies and sexualizes women. And I thought back to my days at West Point and in the Army, and I thought, if my young girls knew some of the women I had gone to school with and served with in the Army, maybe they would consider some other paths. And so, again, words were born, and Porcelain on Steel, women of West Point's long gray line, began in earnest. Now, West Point's an institution that's more than 200 years old, and there are more than 10,000 titles written about West Point, its graduates, and its history. And yet, there were only 5 about women. 3 were individual stories, 1 was a young adult novel, and the other was the PhD dissertation. 3.5 years into this process, thousands of hours of interviews, I got a letter from John Grisham, and John told me, you better prepare for rejection, lots of it. Well, he told me the first 15 publishers and 16 agents rejected him, and there I was, confronted with the fear of rejection again. Patience has never been my strength, but perseverance has, and I knew all I needed was one. And that one came from a Navy and Marine Corps veteran, all through the introduction of a classmate of mine at West Point who I had shared my dream. Dennis Lowry and Jim Zumwalt had formed a company called Fortis Publishing. And Fortis, as many of you know in Latin, is Latin for strong, courageous, and resourceful. And they didn't want to see the stories of these West Point women written in invisible ink. So writing is a discipline. It's about attention to detail, it's about simplicity, and it's also about the fear of being honest. See, in good writing, in really good writing, less is more. And Thomas Jefferson once said, never use two words when one will do. And what I've learned is when you want to make a difference and really impact others, you have to face your fear. And that's the fear of being exposed, wholly and fully, right here and right now. To follow your heart, you have to chase your fear and embrace your fear and go back to those words. And I go back to the words of that cuddly, lovable, honey-eating bear, Winnie the Pooh. There are 3 things to remember. You are braver than you believe, you are stronger than you seem, and you're smarter than you think. Thank you.